Hello everyone, with the closed beta over, I thought now would be a good time to look back on Japan's impressions of the game. For this video, I will be looking at the Japanese YouTuber Igaru's review of the closed beta. His video is currently the most viewed Japanese impression video of the game with over 380,000 views. In the video, he looks at the hype surrounding the game in Japan, a general overview of the game, and what kinds of problems he encountered during the closed beta. First off, Igaru talks about how before the beta test started, Blue Protocol found itself trending on Twitter, and then, even though it was still only a closed beta, the Blue Protocol thread on Gochan bulletin board already had a part 70, so the game was receiving a lot of attention from Japan's online community. However, those who participated in the closed beta were left with a lot of negative impressions. He himself went into the game with high expectations, but was left being unable to say the game was in a good state even for a beta test. Before going into his own impressions of the game, he first explains the reasons for the hype behind the game in Japan. One of the main reasons for interest being generated for the game are its anime aesthetics. And while there are many MMOs being made like this from developers overseas, their graphics and such a lot of times don't appeal to Japanese people. However, Blue Protocol is being made by Bandai Namco, a Japanese company, and although many MMOs recently are being made for smartphones, this game is being made for the PC. It has been a while since people have been able to look forward to this type of game. After this, Igaru goes over the general parts of the game such as the field and dungeons, and says by just looking at these parts as a whole, the game looks quite interesting. He himself had high hopes for the game. However, he then explains why a number of people are being so critical of the game. There isn't one major thing in particular that the game does wrong, but rather a number of small problems that add up. First off, despite calling itself an online action RPG instead of a MMORPG, the action elements of the game don't really stand out. It has an action camera, making it possible to free aim, and it is possible to dodge some attacks by jumping, so it makes you think the game is putting emphasis on the action elements, but playing the game, you just keep clicking and press skills as soon as they come up, which makes the battles feel very simple. Despite there being a number of skills to use, one doesn't need to think much about the order they use the skills, and all the skills seem to just add damage or range, leaving one without need to think about specific situations to use skills. The visual and sound effects also leave much to be desired, and playing one's character just didn't feel that fun. It is hard to believe that this is the quality of a game from 2020. Next up, Igaru talks about the Appraisal System. This is something that wasn't in the alpha, but for some reason was added to beta. There are a number of quests where one needs to gather multiple of a certain item, but because of the Appraisal System, one needs to go back to town to check if they got the right items. So even if one were to get 20 item drops from goblins and think they got 10 goblin claws they need, once they go back to town, they find out they only got 9 goblin claws. So to get the last goblin claw the player needs, they need to go all the way back to the goblins one more time. He really doesn't understand why such an inconvenient system was added to the beta. Continuing on, Igaru talks about the bag system. This is another thing that they made worse from the alpha test. Despite so many quests being about collecting items, the bag size to collect those items is just too small. During the alpha test, the bag size was 100 and items were able to be stacked, but come to the beta, the bag size is only 30 and items can't be stacked. Because of this, one's bag would fill up in about 10 minutes and one would have to go back to town and then head back out to the field constantly. Even if there are plans to increase one's bag size later as a paid option, they should have increased the bag size for the beta test. Next is gathering. Around the field there are multiple points where one is able to gather items. This in itself isn't a problem, but there are too many quests that require players to go to these points. Furthermore, once one has gathered an item from one spot, one needs to go back to town before they can gather there again, and the number of items required is often a large amount. This is something he already had to deal with in a number of games, and is something he thought has finally been resolved in recent games. So he couldn't help but feel this game was behind the times by forcing players to do these types of quests. Next, Igaru talks about the map menu. The map is initially covered by clouds and can slowly be revealed by going to certain points around the field. However, the map is something one wants to look at when they aren't accustomed to an area, but by the time one is able to fully reveal the map, one doesn't need to really look at it anymore. With the current system, one isn't able to see it at first and only can see it after fully exploring it. Next up is the mount. In the game, there is a monster players can ride called a Mount Imagine, but for some reason it has a stamina system, and after riding it for a short distance, one is forced to dismount. One needs to wait before they are able to ride it again. This is also something made worse since Alpha. Despite having to constantly return to town and being forced to move large distances, this mount only makes the problem worse. Next up are the icons. Item icons and skill icons are all colored white. Maybe they were aiming for a simple design, but it makes it difficult to tell the difference between items and what a certain skill is at a glance. As more content gets added to the game, it'll become even more difficult to tell things apart. Next is the lack of rare drops. Usually these type of games have a chance to receive a rare item at a low chance from enemies, and one is able to brag about it to their friends. However, those type of rare drops aren't in this game. So when one has to collect a certain number of a certain item, defeating the same enemy over and over feels quite tedious. Next, he talks about the problem about it being difficult to play with friends. In this game, there are something called channels, and those in the same channel can play together. However, for some reason, one can't choose the channel a friend is in and join them. One can join a party and meet up with them, but that often doesn't work. Even if one were to meet up and go into a dungeon together, after the dungeon is over, they find themselves in different channels once again. This makes it difficult to play with friends, and despite being an online game, he barely saw anybody playing with their friends. Igaru then talks about how, despite this being an online game, there is a lack of communication. This can somewhat be a matter of preference, but in the game's current state, one rarely needs to communicate with others. The only real scenario where one communicates is when a passerby heals you and you say thanks. There was nobody saying anything at the end of dungeons, and the party would be disbanded right away. In addition, there are no things like guilds and no trading items, so he barely used the chat. Guilds do seem to be something that are planned for release, but he isn't sure what people plan to do in those guilds. He finishes his video by saying how overall, it has been around 20 years since MMORPGs became popular, and since then a number of games have been released, and while a number of problems existed in these games, a history of fixing these problems also exists. He believes that if one were to research the good and bad points of these games, the number of problems that he listed could have been avoided. However, in its current state, it's hard to say that these games were properly researched. After these 20 years, this game is coming out, but the only thing that's been improved upon is the graphics. And there's not much about the content that made him feel like it has evolved from MMOs of the past. He says how he knows some people feel like since it is only closed beta, a lot of these problems can be fixed. But he goes on to say how these types of games don't change too much from beta to release, with most development being focused on small adjustments and bug fixes. Last year, Blue Protocol had an alpha test, but moving from alpha to beta, the good changes were overshadowed by the bad changes made, which makes it difficult to hold hope for the future. However, this game is one where one is able to play an anime-like world with great graphics to support it, so it would be a shame to see people drift away from it. So despite criticizing the game so much, he would love to see the game be fixed and become amazing. And that is the end of Igaru's review of the closed beta. I personally did not leave with such a negative impression of the game as Igaru, but I thought this video could show one Japanese player's perspective of the game, and perhaps lead to some discussion of the points he brought up. I will link Igaru's video in the description for those who are interested in taking a look at it. If you would like to see more content like this, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.